A man once forced to kneel in chains. A man beaten until his back carried the scars of cruelty. A man who watched families torn apart while the powerful laughed. But history sometimes creates something unexpected, because the same man who was once treated as property would one day stand before the very people who enslaved him, not as a victim, but as an executioner, and one by one. The masters who built their lives on cruelty began to fall. 89 slave masters and overseers would die under mysterious circumstances, and the most terrifying part of the story? No one realized the truth until the revenge was already complete. Tonight, we uncover the forgotten legend of the enslaved man who became an executioner and turned the system of slavery against itself. Before we begin the story, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the Black Timeline and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. Now let's go back to the early Untold. Across the American South, plantations stretched across miles of land. Fields of cotton and sugar looked peaceful from a distance, but behind that calm landscape existed a world of brutality. Thousands of enslaved Africans were forced to work from sunrise to nightfall. Among them was a quiet young man known only as Malik. Malik had been captured in West Africa as a teenager. He remembered the burning villages, the chains around his wrists, and the terrifying voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. The slave ship was a floating prison. Many never survived the journey. But Malik did. And when he arrived in America, he was sold like an object to a plantation owner famous for his cruelty. From that moment on, Malik's life became a cycle of endless labor, punishment, and silence. But deep inside, something in him refused to break. Years passed on the plantation. Malik worked under overseers who believed fear was the only way to control enslaved people. Whips cracked through the air almost every day. Punishments were public, meant to remind everyone what happened to those who resisted. Malik rarely spoke. He kept his head down and worked harder than most. But while others saw a quiet slave, Malik was watching. He memorized faces. The overseer who whipped children, the master who separated families, the trader who sold mothers away from their sons. Every act of cruelty became part of a growing memory, a silent list forming inside his mind. A list of men who believed they would never face consequences. One year, a small slave rebellion broke out on a nearby plantation. The authorities reacted with extreme brutality. Several enslaved men were captured and sentenced to death. To carry out the punishment, officials brought a professional executioner. His job was simple: hang those accused of rebellion and send a message of fear to everyone else. But fate intervened. The executioner fell sick and was unable to continue his duties. The authorities needed someone strong to assist. Their eyes turned toward Malik. Because of his physical strength and calm nature, he was selected to help with executions. To the slave owners, it was a clever idea. They believed forcing a slave to punish other slaves would crush any hope of rebellion, but they never imagined what this decision would create. Because Malik had just been given something powerful: access. Malik was now taken from the plantation and trained by local authorities. He learned how executions were prepared. He traveled between plantations and towns. For the first time in his life, he could move freely through places that enslaved people were normally forbidden to go, and because he was seen as a tool of the system, no one suspected him. But Malik was still the same quiet observer. He watched powerful men closely. He learned their routines, where they traveled, when they drank, when they slept. The list in his mind kept growing, and slowly, a plan began to form. One night, a cruel overseer named Carter disappeared while traveling between plantations. Days later, his body was discovered in the woods. Authorities assumed bandits were responsible. But enslaved people whispered another possibility. Some believed justice had finally come. Soon another plantation owner died under mysterious circumstances. Then another. Then another. Fear slowly spread among slave masters. They blamed rebels. They blamed runaway slaves. But they never blamed the one man who stood quietly beside them during investigations: the executioner. Years passed. Malik's role as executioner allowed him to travel further across the region. He moved between plantations, courts, and towns. Everywhere he went, he encountered men from the list in his memory. Men who had once whipped him. Men who had sold families apart. Men who believed enslaved people were less than human. One by one, Those men began to disappear. Some were found dead, others vanished completely. Plantation owners became terrified. Meetings were held, guards were hired, but the killings continued because the man responsible walked freely among them and they trusted him completely. After many years, Malik's list had grown long, but eventually, only a few names remained. These were the most powerful slave masters in the region, the men responsible for thousands of enslaved lives. Malik waited patiently. He knew their movements, their habits, their weaknesses. Then one stormy season, several powerful plantation owners died within weeks of each other. The entire region erupted into panic. Authorities launched investigations unlike anything before, but no evidence was ever discovered, and the executioner had already vanished. By the time officials realized something strange had happened, it was too late. Records would later show that 89 slave masters and overseers had died under mysterious circumstances over several decades. No assassin was ever captured. No rebellion was ever proven. But among enslaved communities, a legend spread quietly. They spoke about a man who had survived slavery's cruelty, a man who turned the system against itself, a man who remembered every injustice, the executioner who carried out a secret mission of vengeance. Some believed he escaped north to freedom. Others believed he disappeared into the wilderness, but one thing was certain. His story lived on in whispers passed down through generations. A reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, justice sometimes arrives in unexpected ways. If you found this story powerful, leave a comment and tell us what you think about this forgotten legend. And don't forget to subscribe to the Black Timeline and hit the bell icon so you never miss the hidden stories history tried to bury, because many more stories like this are still waiting to be uncovered. Before we begin the story, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the Black Timeline and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story that history tried to bury. Now, let us travel back in time. Long before modern cities rose from the ground, long before freedom became a word spoken loudly in the streets, there existed a world built on chains. It was the early 19th century, a time when vast plantations stretched across the southern lands of America like endless oceans of cotton. From a distance, these fields looked peaceful, almost beautiful under the golden sunlight. Gentle winds moved across the crops, and white cotton swayed like soft clouds touching the earth. But beneath that quiet surface existed a reality far darker than most people today can imagine. This was the world of slavery, a world where human beings were bought and sold like livestock, a world where the value of a person could be written down in ledgers next to sacks of cotton and barrels of sugar. And within this brutal system lived thousands of enslaved Africans who had been ripped from their homelands and forced into lives of endless labor. Among them was a young man whose name was Malik. Before chains ever touched his wrists, Malik had lived a completely different life. He had grown up in a small village near the western coast of Africa, surrounded by thick forests and rivers that shimmered beneath the sun. His childhood had been filled with the simple rhythms of village life. He helped his father fish along the riverbanks, listened to stories told by elders beside the fire, and ran freely through fields with other children. In those early years, the world seemed large and full of promise. But that world would vanish in a single night. One evening, when the sky had turned dark and the village fires were slowly fading, the sound of shouting shattered the silence. Armed raiders stormed through the village with torches and weapons, capturing anyone they could find. Homes burned. Families were torn apart in moments of chaos. Malik remembered the fear in his mother's voice as strangers dragged him away. He remembered the cries of people fighting to escape. And he remembered the moment when the last sight of his homeland disappeared behind him as he was forced into a long march toward the coast. The journey to the slave ships was brutal. Those captured were chained together, forced to walk for days beneath the scorching sun. Anyone who collapsed was beaten. Anyone who resisted was killed. For Malik, every step carried him farther away from the life he had known. When they finally reached the coast, the prisoners were pushed into the dark belly of a slave ship. The air inside was thick and suffocating. Dozens of people were packed into narrow spaces, chained side by side with barely enough room to move. The ship smelled of sweat, sickness, and fear. Waves crashed against the wooden hull as the vessel carried them across the vast Atlantic Ocean. This journey, later known as the Middle Passage, was one of the most horrifying chapters in human history. Many people did not survive it. Disease spread quickly in the cramped darkness. Food was scarce, and water was rationed carefully. Some prisoners lost hope entirely and refused to eat. Others tried to resist their captors only to face brutal punishment. The sounds of crying and coughing echoed constantly through the ship's hold. Malik was only a teenager, but those weeks at sea changed him forever. He watched people around him slowly fade away from hunger and illness. He saw guards drag lifeless bodies onto the deck before throwing them into the endless ocean below. With every passing day, the boy who had once run freely through the forests of Africa was replaced by someone else, someone quieter, someone hardened by suffering. By the time the ship finally reached the shores of America, Malik had already witnessed more pain than most men see in an entire lifetime. But his journey was not over. When the enslaved Africans were brought ashore, they were forced into markets, where buyers gathered like traders inspecting animals. Plantation owners examined them carefully, checking muscles, teeth, and strength. Families were separated without hesitation. Children were pulled away from their parents. Husbands were sold to distant plantations while their wives were taken somewhere else entirely. Malik stood silently among them, trying to understand what was happening. To the buyers, he was simply another body to be purchased. Eventually, a plantation owner known for his wealth and cruelty selected him. The man believed Malik would make a strong worker in the cotton fields, and within minutes the sale was complete. A few coins exchanged hands, and just like that, Malik's life belonged to someone else. The plantation where Malik was taken was enormous. Rows of wooden cabins housed hundreds of enslaved people who worked the fields every day. Overseers patrolled the land on horseback, carrying long leather whips used to enforce discipline. The rules were strict and unforgiving. Work began before sunrise. A loud bell echoed across the plantation each morning, pulling exhausted workers from their beds. Men, women, and even children marched into the fields while the sky was still dark. They spent the entire day picking cotton beneath the burning sun, their hands bleeding from sharp branches. Anyone who slowed down faced punishment. The overseers believed fear was the only way to maintain control. They carried whips made of thick leather strips, designed to tear skin with every strike. Public punishments were common. When someone tried to escape or resisted orders, they were tied to wooden posts where the entire plantation was forced to watch the whipping. The message was clear: obey or suffer. For many enslaved people, hope slowly disappeared under the weight of endless labor and violence. Some grew quiet and broken, others secretly dreamed of escape, though the dangers were enormous. Armed patrols guarded the roads, and runaway slaves who were captured often faced severe punishment. Malik, however, became something different. From the outside, he appeared obedient and silent. He worked hard in the fields, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Overseers soon began to view him as a reliable worker. But inside, Malik's mind was constantly observing. He watched the plantation carefully. He noticed which overseers were the cruelest. He remembered the faces of slave traders who visited the plantation. He listened when masters spoke carelessly about their business, every insult, every beating, every act of cruelty. Malik remembered it all. He stored those memories quietly, like stones placed carefully in a hidden place. Each stone represented a moment of suffering, a moment when someone had used power to destroy another human being. Years passed in this way. Seasons changed, crops were harvested, and the plantation continued its endless cycle of labor. Malik grew older and stronger. His body hardened from years of work in the fields, but his silence never changed. Some people believed he had accepted his fate, but they were wrong. Malik had not forgotten anything. Deep inside, the list of names in his memory continued to grow. The overseer who whipped a young boy for dropping cotton. The trader who separated a mother from her daughter. The plantation owner who laughed as people suffered under the sun. Each face was burned into Malik's mind. And although no one around him realized it yet, those names were slowly becoming something far more dangerous. They were becoming a record of injustice, a record of cruelty, a record that one day would demand payment. But that moment had not arrived yet. For now, Malik remained just another enslaved worker in the endless fields of cotton, moving silently beneath the watchful eyes of overseers. The masters believed they understood him. To them, he was simply another laborer, another body working the land. They could not see the storm forming quietly beneath the surface. They did not realize that the quiet young man who rarely spoke, who worked without complaint, watched everything with calm, steady eyes. would one day stand at the center of a story that would terrify the very men who believed they owned him. Because history was slowly guiding Malik toward a path no one expected, a path that would transform the silent slave in the cotton fields into something far more powerful, into the man history would one day remember as the executioner. And that transformation would begin sooner than anyone could imagine. As the years slowly passed on the plantation, Malik's life settled into the same harsh rhythm that governed every enslaved person forced to work the land. Each morning began before the sun had even risen above the horizon. The sharp ringing of the plantation bell echoed across the cabins, cutting through the early darkness like a warning that another day of exhausting labor had begun. Men and women climbed out of their small wooden beds, their bodies sore from the previous day, as work. There was little time to rest, little time to think. The overseers demanded movement immediately, and anyone who delayed risked punishment before the day had even begun. Malik joined the long line of workers walking toward the cotton fields. The air was cold in the early morning, but everyone knew the heat would soon arrive. By midday, the sun would burn high in the sky, and the cotton plants would become a sea of sharp branches cutting into hands and arms. Still, the workers moved quietly, each carrying the weight of survival in silence. For Malik, every day felt like a test of endurance. The work was slow and painful. Cotton had to be picked carefully and placed into large sacks that grew heavier as the hours passed. The sacks dragged behind the workers across the dry soil, while overseers rode on horseback nearby, watching closely for any sign of weakness or resistance. Sometimes the overseers shouted, sometimes they threatened, and sometimes they used the whip. The crack of leather cutting through the air became one of the most common sounds on the plantation. The whip was not simply a tool for punishment. It was a weapon of control, designed to remind every enslaved person that their lives were no longer their own. When someone collapsed from exhaustion, the overseers did not show mercy. Instead, they forced the person back to their feet with threats and violence. Malik had witnessed countless punishments during his years on the plantation. Some were small acts meant to frighten the others, a few lashes for working too slowly, a beating for speaking out of turn, but other punishments were far more brutal. One afternoon, a young boy no older than 12 dropped his sack of cotton while trying to keep up with the adults. The boy had been working since sunrise, and his small hands were already bleeding from the sharp branches of the plants. When the overseer noticed the spilled cotton lying on the ground, his anger exploded immediately. Without hesitation, he dragged the boy to the center of the field and tied his wrists to a wooden post. The other workers were forced to stop what they were doing and watch. This was not unusual. Public punishment was a powerful weapon used by plantation owners to spread fear among the enslaved workers. By forcing everyone to witness the violence, they reminded the entire community what would happen if anyone failed to obey. The overseer lifted the whip slowly, letting the silence stretch across the field. Malik could see the boy trembling, tears running down his face as he begged for mercy. But mercy was something rarely seen on that plantation. The first strike of the whip echoed loudly across the field. The boy screamed. Malik felt his hands tighten around the cotton plants in front of him. The sound of the whip cutting into the boy's back seemed to freeze the air itself. Each strike landed with brutal force, tearing into the boy's skin while the overseer continued his punishment with cold determination. The other workers lowered their eyes. Some tried not to watch, but Malik watched everything. He memorized the overseer's face. He remembered the sound of the whip. He remembered the look of fear in the boy's eyes. The punishment ended only when the overseer grew tired. The boy collapsed to the ground, barely conscious, while the workers were ordered to return to their labor as if nothing had happened. Moments like this became part of life on the plantation. Cruelty was not rare. It was routine. Over time, Malik began to understand something important about the system that controlled their lives. The plantation owners believed fear was stronger than hope. They believed that if they created enough pain, the enslaved people would stop thinking about freedom. For many, that belief worked. Years of suffering slowly broke the spirits of countless men and women. Some people stopped speaking altogether. Others simply followed orders without resistance, hoping only to survive long enough to see another sunrise. But Malik's mind worked differently. Instead of forgetting the pain, he remembered it. Every act of cruelty was stored inside his memory like a mark carved into stone. The names and faces of those responsible remained clear in his mind. He did not speak about these memories to anyone else, but they stayed with him every day. One evening, as the workers returned to their cabins after sunset, Malik overheard two older men speaking quietly near the door. Their voices were low, careful to avoid attracting attention. They were talking about families who had been separated by slave traders earlier that week. A group of traders had arrived at the plantation with wagons and chains, searching for people to sell in distant markets. Whenever traders appeared, fear spread quickly through the cabins. Families knew that the traders could take anyone they wanted, and once someone was sold, they were usually gone forever. Malik remembered watching a mother beg the plantation owner not to sell her daughter. The girl had been only 14 years old, and she clung to her mother desperately as the trader pulled her away. The mother screamed and fought with every ounce of strength she had, but the overseers quickly dragged her back. Within minutes, the wagon carrying the girl disappeared down the dusty road. Moments like that never left Malik's mind. He realized that the plantation system was not only about labor, it was about control. The masters controlled where people worked, where they lived, and even who they could love. Families were treated as property. Children were treated as property. Lives were reduced to numbers in a ledger book. As Malik grew older, the weight of these memories became heavier. Yet something inside him refused to break completely. Instead, the pain slowly changed him. He became quieter, more observant, more patient. The overseers noticed his calm behavior and began trusting him with slightly different responsibilities. Sometimes he was asked to carry tools between fields or deliver messages across the plantation. These small tasks allowed him to move around more freely than most workers. While others focused only on surviving each day, Malik paid attention to everything around him. He watched how the plantation operated. He learned which roads traders used when they arrived. He observed the patterns of guards who patrolled the land at night. He noticed how plantation owners often traveled to nearby towns for business meetings or social gatherings. The more Malik observed, the more he began to understand how the system worked. And with that understanding came a quiet realization. The masters believed they were untouchable. They believed their power would last forever. But history had shown that no system built on cruelty could remain unchanged forever. One night, after a long day in the fields, Malik sat outside his cabin watching the moon rise above the trees. The plantation had fallen silent except for the distant sound of insects and the occasional movement of guards on patrol. In that quiet moment, Malik thought about everything he had seen since arriving in this strange land. The burning village, the slave ship crossing the ocean, the markets where people were sold, the punishments in the cotton fields, the families torn apart. All of it formed a single story in his mind, a story of injustice that stretched across years of suffering, and deep inside him, something began to grow. It was not anger alone, it was something stronger, a determination that one day, somehow, the cruelty he had witnessed would not go unanswered. But Malik knew something important. If he acted too quickly, he would die like many others who had tried to resist before him. Patience would be necessary, silence would be necessary, for now, the best weapon he possessed was the one no one could see, his memory. Because every face, every name, every act of cruelty remained clear in his mind. And although the plantation owners believed their actions would be forgotten by time, Malik knew that memory could be a powerful force. One day, those memories would guide him toward a path no one expected, a path that would lead far beyond the cotton fields and the overseers. Whips. A path that would slowly transform the quiet observer into something far more dangerous. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now, Malik continued working in the fields, silent and watchful, while the plantation owners remained completely unaware of the storm forming quietly within the mind of the man they believed they controlled. And soon, an unexpected event would change Malik's life forever, an event that would remove him from the cotton fields, and place him in a position that no enslaved man had ever imagined. A position that would give him something far more powerful than strength, opportunity. The change in Malik's life did not happen suddenly. Like many turning points in history, it began quietly, with an event that at first seemed distant from him. It started on a nearby plantation, several miles away from the fields where Malik and hundreds of others worked every day. News traveled slowly across plantations, usually carried by traders, guards, or enslaved workers who were forced to move between estates. One evening, whispers began spreading through the cabins that something serious had happened. A group of enslaved men from another plantation had attempted to escape. According to the rumors, they had planned the escape carefully for months. They waited for a stormy night when visibility was low and guards were distracted. Under the cover of darkness, they broke into a storage building, gathered tools, and attempted to flee toward the forests beyond the fields. For a brief moment, they tasted the possibility of freedom. But freedom in those days was a dangerous dream. The surrounding countryside was heavily patrolled by slave catchers, armed men who made their living hunting down runaways. Before the escaping men could travel far, they were discovered by patrol riders who quickly organized a search. Within 2 days, the group was captured and dragged back in chains. When they were returned to the plantation, the authorities decided to make an example of them. Punishment for rebellion was severe. The plantation owners feared rebellion more than anything else. A single successful uprising could inspire others across the region to resist the system that held them in chains. To prevent that possibility, slave owners used extreme punishments meant to spread fear throughout the enslaved population. The captured men were accused of organizing a rebellion, and the local authorities ordered public execution. Word of the upcoming punishment spread quickly across nearby plantations. Slave owners wanted the event to be widely witnessed so that every enslaved worker would understand the consequences of resistance. Workers were forced to gather in large groups near the place where the executions would occur. Guards with rifles stood nearby to prevent any attempt at interference. Malik was among those ordered to attend. As he stood within the crowd of enslaved workers, he saw the condemned men being led forward in chains. Their faces showed exhaustion and pain, but there was also something else in their expression. Even after capture and punishment, some of them still carried a quiet sense of dignity. The execution was meant to crush that dignity. The authorities had hired a professional executioner from a nearby town to carry out the punishment. This man had performed executions before and was known for completing his duties without hesitation. The gallows had already been prepared, standing tall and dark against the gray sky. Thick ropes hung from the wooden beams, swaying slightly in the wind. The atmosphere was heavy with tension. The enslaved workers were forced to stand close enough to witness every detail. The masters believed this display of violence would silence any thoughts of rebellion. Malik watched carefully. He observed the movements of the guards, the way the gallows were built, the behavior of the officials organizing the execution. Even in such a grim moment, his mind continued to observe and remember. The executioner approached the first prisoner, preparing the rope while officials read the charges aloud. The man accused of leading the escape attempt stood quietly, his hands bound in front of him. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply lifted his head and looked across the crowd. For a brief moment, his eyes met Malik. Malik did not know the man's name, but the look in his eyes stayed with him long after the execution ended. It was not fear that Malik saw. It was defiance. Moments later, the execution was carried out. The rope tightened. The crowd remained silent. Afterward, the bodies were left hanging for hours as a warning to anyone who might consider rebellion in the future. When the enslaved workers were finally ordered to return to their plantations, the image of the gallows remained burned into their memories. Life returned to its usual routine in the days that followed, but the event had left a deep impression across the region. Plantation owners increased security, fearing that similar escape attempts might happen again. Patrol riders moved more frequently along the roads, and overseers became even harsher in their punishments. Then something unexpected happened. Only a few weeks after the executions, the professional executioner who had been hired for the event fell seriously ill. Some said he had caught a fever while traveling between towns. Others believed the sickness had been spreading through the region for some time. Whatever the cause, the man became too weak to continue working. This created a problem for the authorities. At the time, public punishments and executions were still used regularly by plantation courts to enforce the slave system. Without an executioner available, the officials struggled to find someone capable of performing the task. The job required strength, discipline, and the ability to carry out grim duties without hesitation. After several discussions, a solution was proposed. Instead of searching for another professional executioner, the authorities decided to select a strong enslaved man who could be trained to assist with the role. To them, the idea made sense. An enslaved person could be forced to obey orders, and the plantation owners believed such a person would never dare refuse. Their choice eventually reached the plantation where Malik worked. One afternoon, while the workers were gathered near the tool shed, the overseer approached with several officials from the local authority office. The men walked slowly along the line of workers, studying them carefully. They were searching for someone with the right physical strength and calm demeanor. When their eyes fell upon Malik, they paused. He was taller than many of the other workers, his body hardened from years of labor in the fields. But what caught their attention most was his calm behavior. Malik rarely argued or caused trouble. To the overseers, he appeared disciplined and obedient, exactly the kind of person they wanted. The overseer pointed toward him and ordered him to step forward. Malik obeyed quietly. The officials examined him closely, speaking among themselves in low voices. After a brief conversation, the decision was made. Malik would be taken from the plantation and trained to assist the authorities with executions. To the plantation owner, this arrangement was convenient. Malik would no longer be needed in the cotton fields, and his new role would serve as a reminder to other enslaved workers that resistance was hopeless. The next morning, Malik was placed in a wagon and transported away from the plantation where he had spent years working. As the wagon rolled along the dusty road, he looked back at the distant cotton fields disappearing behind him. For the first time in many years, he was leaving the plantation. But he did not know where the road would lead. The authorities brought him to a small town where local courts handled criminal punishments for the surrounding plantations. There he was introduced to the duties he would be expected to perform. At first, his tasks were simple. He helped prepare the gallows, carried equipment, and assisted officials during punishments. The work was grim and disturbing, but Malik remained silent, observing everything carefully. Over time, he began to learn more about how the system worked. He learned where executions were carried out. He learned how courts decided punishments. And most importantly, he learned how frequently powerful plantation owners traveled between towns to handle their business. Because of his new role, Malik was allowed to move between different locations in ways that ordinary enslaved workers could not. Guards accompanied him at first, but as time passed and he proved reliable, the authorities began trusting him more. To them, he was simply a tool, a silent worker carrying out orders, but they never realized what they had truly given him. They had given him something no enslaved man on the plantations possessed: movement, access, freedom to travel between places where powerful men lived and conducted their business. Malik understood the importance of this change immediately. For years, he had been trapped within the boundaries of a single plantation, watching cruelty unfold without the ability to act. Now, for the first time since arriving in America, he could move through towns, plantations, and roads that stretched far beyond the fields he once worked. And everywhere he traveled, he saw familiar faces, men who had participated in the slave trade, overseers known for their brutality, plantation owners whose wealth depended on the suffering of others. Each time he encountered one of them, the list in his mind grew longer. The system believed it had created a loyal servant, but in reality, it had created something else entirely: a witness. A witness who remembered everything. And slowly, quietly, the quiet observer from the cotton fields began to transform into something the plantation owners could never imagine. The enslaved man they believed they controlled was now standing at the center of a system that trusted him completely. And with that trust came an opportunity that would one day shake the entire region. Because the silent man they had chosen to serve as their executioner was not simply carrying out their orders, he was watching, waiting, and preparing for a future that none of them would see coming. When Malik first arrived in the small courthouse town where the authorities operated, the world around him felt very different from the plantation fields he had known for so many years. Instead of endless rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon, there were wooden buildings, dusty roads, and the constant movement of wagons and horses carrying people between plantations and markets. The town served as a center of power for the surrounding region. Plantation owners traveled there to settle disputes. Traders negotiated deals in busy taverns, and local officials held court sessions where punishments were decided for crimes committed across the nearby plantation. For Malik, the town revealed something he had never been able to see while trapped in the fields: the network that supported the entire system of slavery. In the beginning, his role remained small. The authorities did not immediately trust him with serious responsibilities. Instead, they treated him like an assistant whose purpose was simply to follow orders. He helped gather ropes, repair wooden platforms, and prepare the spaces where punishments were carried out. Often, he stood quietly behind officials while they read sentences to prisoners accused of theft, rebellion, or escape attempts. The work was grim and heavy with silence. Many of the punishments involved enslaved people brought from nearby plantations, and each time Malik watched these moments unfold, the memories of his own life in the cotton fields returned vividly. But Malik continued to do what he'd always done best. He watched. He listened. And he remembered. Every day in the town revealed new information about how power moved through the region. Plantation owners arrived regularly in elegant vans, dressed in fine clothing that showed their wealth and influence. They greeted each other loudly in the streets, laughing and discussing business as if the suffering of the enslaved people who supported their fortunes did not exist. Malik noticed how comfortable they were, how confident they appeared while speaking openly about profits, crops, and trade. To them, slavery was simply the way the world worked. Malik remained silent in their presence, but his mind recorded every detail. He learned which plantation owners controlled the largest lands. He learned which overseers were feared the most among enslaved workers. He listened to conversations between traders who discussed how many people they planned to sell in upcoming markets. Sometimes these men spoke freely in front of him, believing that an enslaved assistant could not possibly understand the importance of what they were saying. They were wrong. Malik understood far more than they imagined. As weeks turned into months, the authorities slowly began trusting him more. They realized he followed instructions carefully and never argued with their commands. Because of this, they started allowing him to assist with tasks that required travel outside the town. Sometimes he accompanied officials to nearby plantations where punishments were ordered by local courts. Other times he helped transport equipment used for executions. Each journey allowed Malik to see more of the region than he ever had before. He traveled along narrow dirt roads lined with thick forests. He passed small communities where enslaved workers lived in crowded cabins near plantation fields. He visited places where courts were temporarily set up to handle disputes between plantation owners. And everywhere he went, Malik continued to observe. One of the most important lessons he learned during these trials was how predictable the powerful men of the region truly were. Plantation owners followed routines that rarely changed. They visited the same taverns when they traveled into town. They rode the same roads when moving between their properties. Some even scheduled regular meetings with traders to discuss the buying and selling of enslaved people. Malik began noticing patterns in their behavior. Certain plantation owners always traveled with only 1 or 2 guards. Others often rode alone when moving between nearby estates. Some preferred to leave town late in the evening after drinking with friends, riding through dark forest roads with little protection. To the masters, these habits felt normal and safe. After all, they believed the system protected them. They believed enslaved people would never dare challenge them. But Malik was beginning to see the system from a different perspective. The very structure that allowed these men to control thousands of lives also made them vulnerable in ways they had never considered. While the masters moved freely across the region, they assumed that every enslaved person they encountered was powerless. They believed that fear alone would keep everyone obedient forever. Malik understood that belief very clearly, and he also understood something else. Their confidence made them careless. Months continued to pass, and Malik's role within the authorities became more established. Eventually, he was trained to prepare the gallows himself whenever an execution was ordered. The officials taught him how to measure the rope, how to secure it to the wooden beam, and how to ensure the structure remained stable during the punishment. It was grim knowledge, but Malik learned quickly. To the authorities, he had become a reliable worker who carried out his duties without hesitation. His quiet nature made them comfortable around him, and some even began treating him with a strange kind of casual familiarity. They spoke openly about cases being handled in the courts, sometimes discussing the crimes of plantation owners as well as enslaved workers. Malik absorbed every piece of information. He learned which powerful men were involved in the harshest punishments against enslaved people. He learned the names of overseers known for violent behavior, and sometimes, when plantation owners gathered in taverns after court sessions, he overheard stories about their actions on distant plantations. Some stories were told proudly, others were whispered quietly, as if the men themselves understood that certain acts of cruelty might be too disturbing to speak about loudly. Malik never interrupted, he simply listened. Every name he heard joined the growing list stored inside his mind. The list had begun years earlier in the cotton fields when he first started remembering the overseers who punished workers without mercy. Now that list expanded beyond a single plantation. It included traders, masters, and overseers across an entire region. Each of them believed their actions would be forgotten. Each of them believed time would erase the suffering they caused. But Malik remembered. One evening, while preparing the gallows for a scheduled execution, Malik paused for a moment to look across the empty courtyard of the courthouse. The sun was beginning to set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the wooden platform where the punishment would take place the following morning. The air was quiet. No guard stood nearby at that moment, and the town itself had grown calm as people returned to their homes. For the first time since arriving in the town, Malik allowed himself to think deeply about the position he now occupied. Years earlier, he had been just another enslaved worker trapped in the cotton fields. His world had been limited to the boundaries of a single plantation, controlled by overseers who believed they owned every moment of his life. Now, he stood in a place where powerful men trusted him enough to work beside them. They allowed him to travel between towns. They allowed him to observe court proceedings. They allowed him to move through spaces where decisions about life and death were made. The system believed it had turned him into a servant of authority. But Malik understood the truth. They had given him something far more powerful than obedience. They had given him access to information, access to movement, access to the men whose cruelty had shaped the lives of countless enslaved people. And for the first time, Malik realized that the memories he had carried for so many years might one day serve a purpose greater than survival. The list in his mind had grown long. Faces from the cotton fields, faces from slave markets, faces from courtrooms and taverns. Each one connected to moments of suffering he had witnessed throughout his life. Malik did not yet know exactly how the future would unfold. But he knew one thing with certainty. The quiet observer who once stood helpless in the fields was no longer powerless. He now moved within the very system that had enslaved him, and while the masters continued their lives believing they were safe, Malik continued to watch everything, because somewhere deep inside his mind, the list of names was slowly becoming something more than memory. It was becoming a record waiting for the day when those responsible for so much suffering would finally face consequences they had never expected. That day had not arrived yet, but it was coming closer with every passing journey, every overheard conversation, and every powerful man who walked confidently past the silent executioners standing quietly in the shadows. And when the moment finally came, none of them would see it coming. As the seasons changed and the years quietly moved forward, Malik, Enslave continued within the strange position he now occupied in the world of the plantation authorities. To the officials and powerful men who controlled the region, he had become something simple and useful, a silent assistant who prepared gallows, followed orders, and never questioned the decisions made by those above him. They believed they understood him. In their eyes, Malik was merely a tool created by the system they controlled, a man whose life had been shaped so completely by slavery that he could never imagine acting outside its boundaries. But they were wrong. Inside Malik's mind, the list continued to grow. Every journey between plantations added new faces to his memory. Every conversation overheard in taverns revealed another man whose wealth and comfort had been built on cruelty. Every courtroom punishment reminded him how easily the powerful could destroy lives without consequence. These memories had once been nothing more than painful reminders of a broken world. But now, with the freedom to travel and observe, those memories began to transform into something else. They began to form a quiet purpose. Malik never rushed his thoughts. Years of surviving in silence had taught him that patience was more powerful than anger. The masters believed enslaved people acted only through sudden rebellion or desperate escape attempts. They expected resistance to appear loudly and violently, something easy to crush with guards and guns. But Malik understood that true change could also grow slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And so he continued watching, waiting, learning. During this time, the town where the courthouse stood remained busy with the constant movement of plantation owners, traders, and officials. Wagons filled the dusty streets each morning as men arrived to conduct business. Taverns echoed with loud conversations at night as wealthy landowners gathered to celebrate profitable harvests or discuss the buying and selling of enslaved workers. The system of slavery moved like a machine, each piece supporting the others in a structure that seemed unbreakable. Malik moved silently within that machine. The authorities often sent him along with officials when punishments were ordered on nearby plantations. Sometimes the courts required public whippings for enslaved workers accused of theft or escape attempts. Other times the sentences were far more severe. Each event allowed Malik to travel across the region. He passed through lands owned by men whose names had long been stored in his memory. Overseers who had once raised whips against exhausted workers now greeted the court officials politely, pretending to respect the law that protected their authority. Plantation masters who had laughed at the suffering of others now spoke proudly about their crops and profits, and every time Malik saw them he remembered. One particular man remained especially clear in Malik's memory. His name was Carter. Carter had once been an overseer on a plantation located several miles from the fields where Malik had first worked. Known for his violent temper, Carter believed the whip was the most effective way to control enslaved workers. Stories about his punishments had spread across nearby plantations, and many enslaved people feared his name even if they had never seen him in person. Malik had witnessed Carter's cruelty years earlier. The overseer had once whipped a young boy for collapsing from exhaustion in the cotton fields. The punishment had been so brutal that the boy could barely stand afterward. The memory of that day remained sharp in Malik's mind. Now, years later, fate placed Carter directly in Malik's path once again. One afternoon, while Malik assisted the authorities during a court session in town, Carter arrived with several other overseers to testify in a case involving an attempted escape. The moment Malik saw him step from his horse, the memory returned clearly. Carter had not changed. His posture remained confident, his voice loud as he spoke with other plantation workers near the courthouse entrance. He laughed easily, speaking proudly about how quickly he punished any enslaved person who dared to challenge his authority. Carter did not recognize Malik. To him, Malik was simply another enslaved assistant belonging to the court system, someone too insignificant to notice. But Malik noticed everything. As the day continued, Malik quietly observed Carter's movements. He watched where the overseer went after the court session ended. He saw Carter visit a tavern with several plantation owners before preparing to ride back toward his plantation in the late evening. The road Carter planned to travel was long and narrow, passing through thick forest land before reaching the open fields beyond town. It was the same road many plantation workers used when moving between estates, and that night Carter rode alone. For most people in the region, such travel felt safe. Plantation owners believed the surrounding communities supported them completely. They assumed that enslaved people were too frightened to challenge their power. Carter clearly believed the same thing. As the sun disappeared behind the trees and darkness began covering the road, the overseer mounted his horse and began the journey home. What happened next would become the beginning of something no one in the region expected. By morning, Carter had not arrived at his plantation. At first, no one worried. It was common for plantation workers and overseers to stay overnight in town if they drank too heavily at taverns or became delayed by business. But when the next day passed without any sign of Carter, concern slowly began to spread. Search riders were sent along the forest road. Hours later, they discovered Carter's horse wandering near the edge of the woods. The animal carried no rider. A short distance away, the overseer's body was found lying beneath a cluster of trees. The discovery shocked the plantation community. Carter had not been robbed, and there were no obvious signs of struggle nearby. The road itself remained quiet, with no witnesses who could explain what had happened. Rumors quickly began spreading across the region. Some believed bandits traveling through the forests were responsible. Others whispered that escaped slaves might have attacked him in secret. But no evidence supported any of these theories. The authorities investigated the scene carefully, questioning travelers and searching nearby areas for signs of attackers. Nothing was found. To the officials, Carter's death became a mystery that could not easily be explained. Malik stood nearby during part of the investigation, assisting the court officials as they recorded information about the incident. He remained silent, watching the confusion spreading among the powerful men gathered around the scene. For the first time, something unusual had happened within the system they believed controlled everything. A man known for his cruelty had died unexpectedly, and no one could explain why. Life in the region slowly returned to normal after the investigation ended without answers. Plantation owners continued their business, and overseers returned to their duties in the fields. But only a few weeks later, another shocking event occurred. A plantation owner named Whitmore disappeared while traveling between two estates he owned several miles apart. When search parties eventually discovered his body near a riverbank, the region once again erupted with fear and speculation. Two powerful men had died within a short period of time. Both deaths were mysterious. Both deaths occurred while the men were traveling alone. Plantation owners began discussing the events during meetings in town. Some demanded increased patrols on the roads. Others suggested that hidden groups of rebels might be forming among enslaved communities. Fear spread quietly through the powerful circles of the region. But Malik noticed something important. Despite their fear, none of the masters suspected the person standing quietly beside them during these conversations. The executioner's assistant, the silent man who prepared the gallows, the man they believed belonged completely to the system they controlled. Malik continued his duties exactly as before. He prepared equipment. He traveled with officials. He listened to the conversations of men who were slowly becoming uneasy about the safety of their world. Inside his mind, the list remained clear: names, faces, memories of cruelty stretching back through years of suffering. The deaths of Carter and Whitmore were only the beginning of something larger, though no one around Malik realized it yet. The plantation system believed it was unshakable, but something had begun moving quietly beneath its surface. A silent storm. A force that did not announce itself with rebellion or loud resistance. Instead, it moved carefully, patiently, striking without warning. And the most frightening truth of all was this: the men who believed they controlled the region were unknowingly standing beside the very person who understood their world better than anyone else. The quiet observer who had spent years watching their cruelty was still there, still listening, still remembering. And somewhere deep within his mind, the list of names continued waiting for the moment when justice, long delayed and long denied, would finally begin to arrive, one name at a time. The mysterious deaths of Carter and Whitmore did not fade from memory as quickly as many plantation owners had hoped. In the weeks that followed, conversations across the region slowly changed in tone. At first, the powerful men who controlled the plantations had tried to dismiss the incidents as accidents or the work of wandering criminals. But as time passed and no explanation appeared, uncertainty began to creep into their voices. Plantation owners who once rode confidently across lonely roads now began traveling in pairs. Some hired additional guards to escort them between towns. Others avoided traveling at night altogether, choosing instead to remain within the safety of their estates after sunset. Yet despite these precautions, life across the plantations continued much as it always had. Cotton fields stretched endlessly beneath the burning sun. Enslaved workers bent over rows of plants from dawn until dark. Malik continued performing his duties exactly as the authorities expected. Each day he prepared equipment, assisted court officials, and traveled with them to plantations where punishments were ordered. To everyone around him, nothing about his behavior appeared unusual. He remained silent, obedient, and calm in every situation. The masters trusted him. The officials trusted him. Even the guards who accompanied the authorities began treating him as a familiar presence rather than a suspicious one. That trust gave Malik something incredibly valuable: freedom to move. Unlike most enslaved people in the region, Malik was no longer confined to a single plantation. His role within the court system allowed him to travel across multiple estates, towns, and roads that stretched far beyond the fields where he had once labored. Each journey provided new opportunities to observe the powerful men who controlled the region, and Malik used those opportunities carefully. He began paying closer attention to the daily routines of plantation owners and overseers. Over time, he discovered that many of them followed predictable patterns that rarely changed. Some traveled into town every week to meet with traders or attend court sessions. Others visited neighboring plantations regularly to discuss crop production or exchange laborers. Certain men enjoyed drinking late into the night at taverns before beginning the long ride back to their estates. These habits created moments of vulnerability. Moments when powerful men traveled alone along quiet roads where no witnesses stood nearby. Malik did not rush his decisions. Patience had always been his greatest strength. Years earlier, when he had first arrived on the plantation as a young enslaved worker, anger had filled his thoughts every day. But as time passed and he learned how the system truly operated, he realized that anger alone could never defeat something so large and powerful. Only careful planning and patience could accomplish that. So he waited. He continued traveling with the authorities, silently gathering information about the men whose names had long been stored in his memory. Some of these men were plantation owners known for extreme cruelty toward their workers. Others were overseers who used violence as their primary method of control. A few were slave traders responsible for transporting countless men, women, and children away from their families. Each one represented a piece of the suffering Malik had witnessed throughout his life. Each one represented a name on the list. The list had begun many years earlier, when Malik first started memorizing the faces of those who caused pain within the cotton fields. Now that list had expanded beyond a single plantation, stretching across an entire region of powerful men who believed their actions would never face consequences. Malik remembered every one of them. One evening, while assisting officials during a court session in a neighboring town, Malik overheard a conversation that revealed something important. Two plantation owners were discussing a wealthy landowner named Douglas Harper, a man whose estate stretched across thousands of acres of cotton land. Harper had gained a reputation for harsh punishments and strict control over the enslaved workers on his property. Malik had heard the name before. Years earlier, when he still worked in the fields, Harper had purchased several enslaved families from the plantation where Malik lived. Those families were separated during the sale, with parents and children sent to different estates miles apart. The cries and protests from that day had stayed with Malik ever since. Now Harper's name returned to his thoughts once again. As the two plantation owners continued their conversation, Malik learned something else. Harper planned to travel into town later that week to attend a meeting with traders who were arranging a large sale of enslaved workers. After the meeting, he intended to return to his plantation the same evening using a narrow forest road that cut several miles off the usual route. Malik said nothing, but he listened carefully. The days passed slowly until the evening Harper arrived in town. The wealthy plantation owner spent several hours meeting with traders and discussing the upcoming sale. Later that night, he visited a tavern where several other landowners gathered to celebrate the profitable arrangement. Malik watched from a distance. When Harper finally left the tavern, the streets had grown quiet. Most of the town, as residents had already returned to their homes, leaving the roads dimly lit by a few scattered lanterns. Harper mounted his horse and began the journey back toward his plantation. The forest road he chose was narrow and surrounded by thick trees that blocked much of the moonlight. It was a road where travelers rarely encountered others at night. The next morning, Harper did not arrive at his estate. At first, the workers on his plantation assumed he had simply stayed overnight in town, but when an entire day passed without any sign of him, concern began spreading among his overseers. Search riders were quickly sent along the forest road he had traveled the previous night. What they found shocked the entire region. Harper's horse stood quietly near the edge of the road, its reins tangled in a low tree branch. A short distance away, Harper himself lay motionless on the ground. The wealthy plantation owner who had once controlled thousands of acres of land and hundreds of enslaved workers was dead. Once again, the authorities rushed to investigate. Court officials examined the scene carefully, searching for signs of bandits or runaway slaves. Guards questioned travelers who might have passed along the road during the night. But as before, no clear explanation emerged. Harper's death joined the growing list of mysterious events that had begun troubling the plantation community. 3 powerful men had now died under strange circumstances. Fear spread more quickly this time. Plantation owners gathered for urgent meetings, demanding stronger patrols and greater protection along the roads. Some suggested that secret groups of rebellious slaves were organizing attacks. Others insisted that criminals must be hiding somewhere within the forests surrounding the region. But the truth remained hidden, because the man responsible continued standing quietly beside them. Malik listened as the officials discussed their concerns, carefully recording details about Harper's death. None of them suspected that the silent assistant standing nearby understood far more about the situation than anyone else. For Malik, Harper's death represented something important. It proved that the powerful men who controlled the region were not as untouchable as they believed. They could be reached, they could be confronted, and they could be brought down one by one. But Malik also understood that his actions needed to remain invisible. If the authorities ever discovered the truth, his life would end quickly. The plantation system would crush anyone who threatened its power. So Malik continued moving carefully. He maintained the same quiet behavior that had earned the trust of officials and masters alike. He traveled between plantations with the authorities, helping prepare punishments and observing the endless cycle of cruelty that defined life for enslaved workers. But behind that calm exterior, something else had begun taking shape. A mission. Not one driven by reckless anger, but by years of memory and careful observation. The names on Malik's list were no longer just memories of past suffering. They were becoming targets. Each man on that list represented a story of pain that had gone unanswered for far too long. And slowly, patiently, the list was beginning to change. Names were disappearing, end by end. While the plantation owners grew more fearful and confused with every new mysterious death, Malik continued his work exactly as before, the silent executioner as assistant, the obedient servant of the courts, the man they trusted to stand beside them during moments of punishment and judgment. None of them realized that the quiet observer they had allowed into their world was carrying out something far more powerful than simple obedience. He was carrying out a mission that would continue growing in ways no one could yet imagine. And before it was finished, The number of powerful men who had fallen under mysterious circumstances would climb far higher than anyone believed possible. By the time several years had passed since the first mysterious deaths began troubling the region, the atmosphere among the plantation owners had changed in ways few of them wanted to admit openly. At first, they had dismissed the early incidents as accidents, robberies, or unfortunate encounters with criminals along the roads that connected their estates. But as time continued moving forward, the number of unexplained deaths quietly grew. Some plantation owners disappeared during travel between towns. Others were found lifeless along forest roads or near isolated riverbanks where they had stopped to rest their horses. No clear pattern was ever discovered. Yet the fear slowly spread. The men who once traveled confidently through the countryside began behaving differently. Many of them started carrying pistols during their journeys. Some hired armed guards to escort them between plantations. Late-night drinking gatherings in taverns became less frequent, as wealthy landowners worried about traveling home in darkness. The region that had once felt completely secure for the powerful was slowly filling with quiet tension. But despite these growing fears, no one had discovered the truth. No one had identified the person responsible. And most importantly, no one had even considered the possibility that the man standing silently beside them during court sessions and investigations might hold the answer. Malik continued living exactly as the authorities expected. His duties within the court system had now become routine. He prepared equipment for punishments, assisted officials during public executions, and traveled with court representatives to plantations where disputes were settled. Because he had served quietly and reliably for so long, the authorities no longer questioned his presence. He had become invisible within their world. To the masters and officials, Malik was simply part of the machinery that kept their system functioning. They no longer looked closely at him. They no longer wondered what he might be thinking. That invisibility gave Malik something more powerful than freedom. It gave him protection. The list inside his memory had grown over many years, shaped by every act of cruelty he had witnessed throughout his life. Each name represented a man who had built his authority through violence and suffering. Some were plantation owners who controlled hundreds of enslaved workers. Others were overseers known for brutal punishments. A few were traders who made fortunes transporting families across distant markets, separating parents from children without hesitation. Over time, that list had grown long. But as the mysterious deaths continued across the region, the list slowly began growing shorter. One by one, the names were disappearing. Some plantation owners died suddenly while traveling through remote areas. Others vanished without explanation during business journeys between towns. Occasionally, bodies were discovered days later in places far from the roads where they had last been seen. Each death sent waves of anxiety through the plantation community. Meetings among wealthy landowners became more serious. They gathered in large houses and court buildings to discuss the growing problem that none of them could explain. Some believed rebellious groups of enslaved workers were secretly organizing attacks. Others insisted that criminals hiding in the forests must be responsible. But every investigation ended the same way, with no answers. Malik listened carefully to these conversations whenever they occurred. He stood quietly in the background during meetings, assisting court officials or preparing documents while the powerful men spoke about their fears. None of them realized that the silent assistant standing nearby already knew exactly why the region was changing, because Malik understood something they did not. Fear had finally reached the masters themselves. For generations, enslaved people had lived under constant fear of punishment, separation, and death. The plantation system had depended on that fear to maintain control. But now, slowly and quietly, the direction of that fear had begun to shift. Now it was the masters who felt uncertain. Now it was the masters who looked over their shoulders while traveling lonely roads. Now it was the masters who wondered whether someone might be watching them in the darkness. Malik observed these changes without showing any reaction. His face remained calm and silent during every conversation, just as it had been for years. Inside his mind, however, he knew the truth. The mission he had carried quietly for so long was nearing its final stage. The list that once contained many names had grown much shorter. Only a few remained. And those final names belonged to some of the most powerful men in the entire region. These were plantation owners whose estates covered thousands of acres of land. Their wealth and influence extended far beyond a single county. Some of them maintained close relationships with traders, politicians, and court officials. They believed their power placed them far above the dangers that threatened ordinary men. But Malik knew their routines better than they realized. Years of observation had revealed their habits, their schedules, and the roads they used most often. These men traveled frequently between their estates and nearby towns to conduct business. They attended social gatherings with other landowners discussing crops, profits, and trade agreements. And just like the men before them, they often believed they were safe. One of the final names on Malik's list belonged to a plantation owner known as Samuel Ridley. Ridley controlled several large cotton estates and was widely feared among enslaved workers for the punishments he ordered. Stories about his cruelty had spread across plantations for years. Some workers whispered that he personally supervised whippings whenever someone attempted to escape. Malik had never forgotten Ridley. Years earlier, Ridley had purchased several enslaved families from the plantation where Malik had once worked in the fields. Those families were separated immediately after the sale. Mothers and children were taken to different estates without any chance to say goodbye. Malik remembered the cries that filled the yard that day. The memory had stayed with him ever since. Now Ridley's name stood among the final few remaining on the list. One autumn evening, news reached the courthouse that Ridley planned to travel into town for a meeting with other plantation owners. They intended to discuss new trade arrangements that would expand their cotton shipments to distant markets. As usual, the meeting would take place in a large tavern where landowners often gathered for business discussions and celebrations. Malik heard the information while assisting court officials earlier that day. He said nothing, but he remembered. When Ridley arrived in town that evening, the tavern quickly filled with laughter and loud conversation. Wealthy plantation owners gathered around tables covered with food and drink, celebrating their business successes while discussing plans for the future. Malik remained nearby, completing his usual duties for the court officials. Late into the night, Ridley finally prepared to leave. The other landowners offered friendly farewells as he stepped outside to mount his horse. Like many men who believed themselves powerful, Ridley chose to travel alone. His plantation lay only several miles away, connected to the town by a narrow road passing through thick forest land. The moon was hidden behind clouds as Ridley began the journey home. The following morning, his plantation workers noticed something unusual. Ridley had not returned. At first, the overseers assumed he had stayed overnight in town, but when riders were sent to confirm his location, the truth began to emerge. Ridley had never arrived anywhere. Search parties quickly spread along the forest road leading back toward his estates. Hours later, one of the riders discovered Ridley's horse wandering freely near the edge of a clearing. A short distance away, the plantation owner was found lying motionless beneath a large oak tree. The news spread quickly across the region. Samuel Ridley, one of the most powerful plantation owners in the area, was dead. Once again, the authorities launched an investigation. Guards searched the forest. Officials questioned travelers who had passed along the road, but as before, no clear answers appeared. Ridley's death joined the growing list of unexplained events that had been haunting the plantation community for years. By now, fear had become impossible to ignore. Meetings among landowners turned serious and urgent. Some demanded stronger patrols across the region. Others insisted that hidden enemies must be plotting against them. But the truth remained hidden in plain sight, because the quiet man who had spent years watching their cruelty was still standing beside them, still listening, still remembering. And now, with Ridley's death, only one name remained on Malik's list. One final man whose actions had caused suffering beyond measure. One final man who believed his power would protect him forever. The mission that had begun so quietly years earlier was approaching its final moment. And when that moment arrived, the entire region would finally realize something terrifying. The silent observer they had trusted for so long had been moving through their world with a purpose they never imagined. By the time Malik reached the final stage of his long, patient mission, the atmosphere across the region was tense and filled with a quiet, almost palpable fear. Plantation owners and overseers had begun to whisper among themselves, suspicious of every shadow along the road, every figure who passed through town, and every servant or assistant who had access to information about their routine. Rumors of mysterious deaths and disappearances had spread far and wide, but no one had yet realized that the silent man they had come to trust, the executioner, as assistant, was at the center of everything. Malik had spent years building the perfect conditions for what was to come. He had watched, listened, and remembered with unwavering focus. Each name on his list represented a story of cruelty, pain, and injustice. And with each mysterious death that occurred, the system that enslaved so many trembled quietly, unaware that the forces shaping these events were closer than they could ever imagine. The final name on the list was the most dangerous of all, a plantation owner whose influence reached farther than any other, a man whose decisions had sent countless enslaved people into despair, and whose power had shielded him from consequences for decades. This man, Jonathan Blackwood, was the pinnacle of the system of slavery, the embodiment of oppression, and the last obstacle between Malik and the completion of his mission. Blackwood controlled multiple plantations and oversaw hundreds of enslaved workers. He had a reputation for cunning and ruthlessness. Stories of his brutal punishments had circulated for generations, and his name alone was enough to instill fear in both enslaved people and free workers who knew of his power. Blackwood traveled often, attending markets, settling disputes, and maintaining relationships with other powerful men in the region. Yet, despite his intelligence and caution, he shared the same fatal flaw that all the others had. He underestimated those he considered insignificant. Malik learned of Blackwood routines in the same way he had learned the routines of Carter, Whitmore, Harper, and Ridley. Over weeks of careful observation, he memorized the roads Blackwood used, the inns where he rested, the taverns where he discussed business, and the predictable timing of his travels between estates. This information was invaluable. Unlike the others, Blackwood was well guarded and cautious, but Malik's patience had taught him that even the most vigilant men had moments of vulnerability. The key was to wait for the precise moment when opportunity and precision aligned. The days leading to Blackwood's journey were filled with quiet tension in Malik's mind. He performed his duties as usual, preparing the gallows, assisting officials, and traveling between plantations, all while hiding the intensity of his focus. Each time he passed the names of the men he had already marked off the list in his mind, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. These were men whose cruelty had scarred generations. Now, through meticulous planning, patience, and observation, Malik had set the stage for justice. Finally, the day arrived. Blackwood had agreed to travel to a distant town for a business meeting that would last late into the evening. The roads he would take were narrow and bordered by thick forest, a choice dictated by speed and efficiency. Malik had carefully noted the time of departure, the expected duration of travel, and the location where the master planned to rest. Everything was in place. Every detail had been considered, every variable accounted for. As Blackwood prepared to leave the town, Malik remained nearby, blending into the shadows like he always had. His role as the executioner, as assistant, allowed him to move freely, unseen and unquestioned. Guards, travelers, and even Blackwood himself assumed Malik had no knowledge or influence over the events that were about to unfold. This assumption was precisely what Malik needed. The journey began. Blackwood rode along the forest road, confident in his routine and unaware of the silent presence tracking every movement. Hours passed, and the moon rose high into the sky, casting dim light along the path. The forest was quiet, save for the sound of hooves against the dirt road. Blackwood's thoughts were occupied with his business dealings, his wealth, and the comfort of the life he believed was untouchable. At the precise moment Malik had calculated, he made his move. Every detail, every step of the plan, had been rehearsed in his mind countless times. He knew exactly where to position himself, and how to ensure that Blackwood's journey would end without a trace of interference from guards or onlookers. The execution of the plan was silent, swift, and precise. When the deed was done, Malik did not linger. He returned to the town, blending seamlessly with the routine life around him. No one suspected a thing. Blackwood, the man whose cruelty had touched countless lives and whose influence had shielded him for decades, was gone. His disappearance would be attributed to the dangerous forest roads, to accident, or to bandits. The authorities and other plantation owners would investigate, search parties would comb the forests, but the truth would remain hidden. Malik's careful planning ensured that no evidence pointed to him. With Blackwood's death, the list was finally complete. Every name that had caused suffering, pain, and terror in Malik's life was accounted for. Every man whose cruelty had scarred generations of enslaved people had faced a mysterious end, orchestrated by someone they believed powerless. Malik's mission, years in the making, had reached its conclusion. The system that had once seemed unbreakable had been shaken quietly, invisibly, and with perfect precision. Yet Malik did not stop with vengeance alone. He understood that the true power of his actions lay not only in punishing the cruel, but in sending a message to those who remained in the shadows of oppression. Through careful observation and decisive action, he had shown that even the most powerful could be held accountable. His strategy had been slow, patient, and methodical, proving that intelligence and planning were as powerful as brute strength. In the days that followed, rumors about the final death spread across the region. Plantation owners spoke in hushed tones about the strange pattern of misfortune, about the series of mysterious deaths that had claimed some of the most influential men in the area. Fear became a constant companion for those who remained, altering routines, changing behavior, and shaking the confidence of men who had once believed they were untouchable. Malik remained present, yet invisible, continuing his duties as the executioner's assistant. No one suspected the role he had played, and he continued moving within the system, silently observing, silently commanding respect through the power of his knowledge and discretion. Malik's life had transformed completely. From the young enslaved man who had endured years of brutality in the cotton fields, he had become a master of patience, strategy, and execution. He had turned the tools of the system against its perpetrators, reshaping the balance of power without ever revealing his true intentions. His name remained unknown, his role hidden, but his actions had left an indelible mark on the region. As he stood quietly in the courthouse one evening, preparing the equipment for yet another routine punishment, Malik allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The memories of the suffering he had witnessed, the friends and families torn apart, and the countless acts of cruelty were no longer sources of anger alone. They were the foundation of his mission, the motivation that had guided him through years of observation, travel, and planning. The final stage of his journey had brought justice in a form that the powerful men of the region could neither anticipate nor comprehend. Malik had demonstrated that the quiet, patient, and observant could achieve what brute force alone could not. His mission had been completed not with loud rebellion, but with precision, patience, and intelligence, a silent reckoning for generations of pain. Even as the fear among the remaining plantation owners spread, Malik remained a figure of quiet authority. He continued his duties, never drawing attention to himself, but the knowledge of what had occurred lingered in the minds of those who survived. The system of slavery, though still in place, had been shaken at its core, and Malik, the once powerless boy who had endured unimaginable suffering, had become a symbol of strategy, endurance, and unseen power, a living testament to the strength of those who refused to be broken. As he looked across the quiet town from the steps of the courthouse, Malik understood something profound. The work of justice is often invisible to those who believe themselves untouchable. True power lies not in wealth, title, or fear, but in the careful observation, patience, and intelligence of those who have been forced to endure injustice. And in that quiet understanding, Malik knew that he had not only avenged the past, he had reshaped it in ways that would echo long after the shadows had passed. Finally, he allowed himself a small, silent acknowledgement of the journey he had endured. Each name on the list, each act of cruelty remembered, each life that had been shaped by oppression, it had all led to this moment. Malik had turned the system against itself, proving that even the most powerful are vulnerable to the quiet force of a mind that refuses to forget, refuses to submit, and refuses to be powerless. And as the night settled over the town, Malik continued his work, his presence unnoticed, his mission complete, yet his vigilance never ending. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment below sharing how much this story moved you. The hidden histories of courage and justice must never be forgotten.